Breaking free from the religion of my family was an extremely difficult journey. The message was my life. It was more than just my faith. It was my community. I was raised to believe the prophet. My father was raised to believe the prophet. My grandfather, a former Methodist minister, believed the prophet and pastored the prophet's church in Jeffersonville for over 50 years. My grandfather was converted to the message at a revival in Macon, Georgia. He often told the story about the prophet's supernatural abilities in that meeting, how the prophet had the power to discern names, addresses, and diseases. On stage, the prophet accurately told a woman her name, her address, and disease. When she returned to her seat, right in front of my grandfather, she was astonished. Not only had he known her name, address, and disease, he knew the impossible. According to my grandfather, the lady said that she had changed her address just the week before, and that the prophet knew not only her address, but he knew her new address. I vividly remembered the crowd at Branham Tabernacle when my grandfather told his conversion story. Like myself, everyone in the building praised and worshiped God for this event, even though we were never there. We were happy to believe and eager to receive. I never will forget the sinking feeling I had the first time I saw a prayer card. For over 30 years, I'd heard recordings of the prophet when he would accurately discern a person's name and address and tell them whether or not they were a Christian. But it felt entirely different seeing the handwritten note that the discerned person gave the ushers before the healing meeting. We were told that the card was only necessary for identifying a position in line to see the prophet, and that the angel of God was the one giving the prophet a name, address, and disease. According to my grandfather, however, the woman had written her old address on the prayer card, not her new address. Seeing the prayer card, combined with everything else I had discovered, made me very uncomfortable. If the cards were only used to keep the line in order, then why did the prophet need the people to write down everything that the angel was going to help him discern? Why not just give them a piece of paper with a number? Faith healers practicing discernment using prayer cards were common during that era, and the practice was not unique to William Branham. A. Allen, Jack Coe, Oral Roberts, and many others used prayer cards in their meetings. All of the healers claimed that these cards were used to keep the people in order by number. But many healers who practiced discernment collected the information that they discerned before the meeting started. In the message, we were told that those other healers were fakes because they used deceitful practices. I never knew that our prophet was using the same technique as other prophets. Listening to the recordings of the prayer lines was a much different experience without this information. I shuddered to think that even Reverend Jim Jones had what many claim to be a very accurate gift of discernment, especially after I learned that William Branham helped launch Jim Jones' faith healing ministry at the Cadle Tabernacle in Indianapolis in 1956. How did the prophet convince my grandfather to join the message? In the message, we were taught that the prophet was given his gift of discernment on May 6, 1947, and that this exact day held spiritual significance. According to the prophet, it was the same day that Israel became a nation. He said, "And a very strange thing of that you might not know. The very day that the angel of the Lord called me out, May the 6th, 1947, and issued a gift to pray for the sick, was the very same day that Israel became a nation for the first time in 2,500 years." I never really thought about the fact that the prophet claimed to have this gift on sermons recorded in April of 1947 before this gift would be given, or that in the same sermon he claimed to be able to heal cross-eyed children without God's assistance. I also never knew that the Voice of Healing was created in April of 1948 to promote his own campaigns. It came as a surprise to me that the very first issue of the Voice of Healing would contain disclaimers as to why some people that the prophet healed never improved. This was only supposed to be 1 year into the prophet's healing ministry. I wondered, how long had the prophet claimed to have the gift of healing and discernment? We were never told that the prophet was the original publisher of the Voice of Healing, or that the subscribers were sending letters including their names and addresses. We were never told that subscribers were asked to notify the prophet when their address changed, or that subscribers were offered a deal for a gift subscription giving the prophet names and addresses of other people. The newsletter advertised many other healers with the gift of discernment. Was the prophet selling names and addresses to other healers? Was the Voice of Healing business established to create faith healing ministries? Was all this nothing more than a pyramid scheme? Something about the timeline was bothering me. I'd already established that the Billy Branham Pentecostal Tabernacle was actually planted by Roy E. Davis and filled with congregants from his church from before he was extradited on criminal charges. I'd also established that Davis was a high-ranking member of the Ku Klux Klan and working with multiple white supremacy groups. I'd learned that the prophet was working with E. Howard Cadle and discovered the history of the Ku Klux Klan's invasion of the Indiana government in the mid-1920s. I'd learned that F. Bosworth had a background in healing cults, healing revivals, and worked with a leader who used religion for political influence, money, and power. I'd also learned that Bosworth was doing damage control for those healed who never improved, some of which died. I discovered that shortly after working with Cadle, the prophet and his second wife, Meta, were married by a United Brethren minister, which was a direct result of E. Howard Cadle planting Brethren churches in the area. But if the prophet wanted people to think that his healing ministry started in 1947, and that his Pentecostal experience started long after leading Roy Davis's Pentecostal church congregation, I wondered, what wasn't he wanting us to see? Why did the name of the Pentecostal Tabernacle change to Branham Tabernacle in 1945? Was he still working with Roy Davis and the Ku Klux Klan? I began to study the early photographs of the prophet's early church and noticed something that I had never seen before. As many times as I had looked at the early congregation posing inside the church, for as many years as I had seen that photograph, I had never noticed that one person in the photograph was completely blacked out. I couldn't believe my eyes. Someone had meticulously covered the person in dark black ink, so carefully that they did not leave a trace of the body. At casual glance, it made it look as though the figure was a shadow of another person, yet it sat erect. It was not cast from another person blocking light. Who was this mysterious figure, inked out in the early Billy Branham Pentecostal Tabernacle photos? It was clear that part of the prophet's timeline had been erased. Was this figure involved with whatever was erased from the timeline? When the name of the prophet's church was changed and the first advertisement of the Branham Tabernacle was published in the newspapers, I found a familiar name. The Reverend Robert Daugherty was listed in the advertisement. It was a name that I knew well, though it did not seem to fit with the timeline of this 1945 newspaper article. The prophet claimed to have healed Daugherty's daughter Betty, yet he also claimed that his gift of healing came in 1947, 2 years after 1945. The story of her healing was published in a pamphlet that was no longer available to message believers, that was entitled, "I Was Not Disobedient to the Heavenly Vision." I had never read the pamphlet. A former message minister had a copy of the tract and was able to let me read it for the first time. The author of the publication, the prophet, sounded much different than the illiterate backwoods prophet that I grew up hearing. The words written were eloquent and refined, very formal. It was not the Kentucky hillbilly English that the prophet used in the ministry that I grew up hearing. To my surprise, the prophet was sending a message to readers about a vision of white-robed people. I couldn't believe my eyes. I was looking for clues into what happened with Roy E. Davis and his involvement with the Ku Klux Klan, searching for the missing years after 1939, when Davis was extradited to Hot Springs, Arkansas. As I looked at the 1945 date of the publication and read about his white-robed vision and healing campaign, I thought about the version of the message that we were told and how different it was from recorded history. Being raised to believe his healing ministry started in 1947, it was very difficult for me to see this 1945 date. Before reading this, I'd assumed that his attempts at healing in the early 1940s had failed, and that the prophet was trying to claim he didn't yet have the gift. This tract confirmed that he did have a healing ministry before 1947, and that he was fully aware of his gift. I knew by now that the leaders of the message were hiding something, but I'd never considered hiding an entire healing campaign that was for white-robed people. The Ku Klux Klan were known as the White Knights, and every single member was given a white robe. The research trail for Roy E. Davis had grown cold. I traced him through Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas from 1914 to 1917. Largely thanks to his highly publicized and unusual immoral and criminal activities, I traced him through Georgia, South Carolina, and Tennessee. Due to his rank of official spokesperson for the Ku Klux Klan and his living a dual life with multiple wives in multiple states, I'd tracked him through Tennessee, Kentucky, and southern Indiana, where he planted the Prophet's Church. But after Roy Davis was extradited from Jeffersonville to Hot Springs, Arkansas, in connection with murder and grand theft auto, Davis himself appears to have gone into hiding. There was no trace of him to be found. Roy Davis is a common name, and there were numerous Roy Davis listings. There were over 36,000 records to examine in just one of the many archive tools. I began searching multiple keywords, multiple names familiar to the message. By sheer accident, I stumbled onto a Reverend Roy E. Davis in the Los Angeles Times. Former Congressman William D. Upshaw had helped this Roy E. Davis pose as an FBI agent to secure donations for an orphanage. William Upshaw was a name that I was intimately familiar with. Former Congressman Upshaw was one of the more famous people that the prophet claimed to have healed. Suddenly, all the pieces of this puzzle were starting to make sense. The Ku Klux Klan, the liquor and criminal activity, the healing campaigns, the Knights of the Flaming Sword, the crippled congressman, seen posing with his crutches in many photographs. It made sense why leaders of the message would erase years of the prophet's early ministry, and why the prophet himself would change or erase so many stories of past experiences. I turned back to the photograph of the early church congregation and examined it more closely. I could see the prophet standing in the middle of the photograph holding his Bible in his left hand, as he often posed for the camera. Several people were standing on either side of him, filling the platform from the back wall of the church to the first pew. There were several people sitting in the pews, twisted awkwardly to show their faces to the camera. I looked closely at the figure that had been inked out, sitting next to one of the structural columns of the building. Suddenly I noticed it. Next to the figure that had been blacked out, erased from the photograph, was a single crutch leaning against the pew beside him. Was the figure that had been erased the former Congressman Upshaw? Was this the single crutch that he posed with in all the photographs that I had seen of the former congressman?